The morning fog rolled across the Pacific like a ghostly shroud, its tendrils reaching toward the California coastline, where Naval Air Station Alameda buzzed with wartime urgency. It was October 15, 1944, and Lieutenant Commander James Robert Sullivan stood on the tarmac, adjusting his leather flight jacket against the pre-dawn chill. At 28 years old, he was considered a veteran pilot, having completed 47 combat missions over the Pacific theater. His steel-blue eyes reflected the same determination that had earned him 2 distinguished flying crosses and the respect of every man in his squadron. The war was entering its 4th year, and every mission carried the weight of a nation's hopes. Sullivan's Grumman F-6F Hellcat, designated as Navy No. 77492, gleamed under the hangar lights despite the early hour. Ground crews had worked through the night, preparing the aircraft for what intelligence officers had classified as a routine reconnaissance mission along the Northern California coast. But in wartime, nothing was ever truly routine. The briefing had been unusually sparse, conducted by a stern-faced intelligence officer whose credentials seemed to extend far beyond the typical Navy chain of command. The mission parameters were straightforward, yet oddly specific. Fly northwest along the coastline toward Point Reyes, then follow a prescribed route inland toward the Russian River Valley. Maintain radio silence, except for predetermined checkpoints. Photograph any unusual ground activity, and return to base within 4 hours. What made the assignment peculiar was the emphasis on complete secrecy and the presence of 2 men in civilian suits who observed the briefing without speaking a single word. Sullivan had questioned the mission's classification level, noting discrepancies in the paperwork that suggested involvement from agencies beyond standard naval intelligence. His squadron commander, a grizzled veteran named Captain William Hartley, had been unusually tense during the pre-flight discussion, repeatedly emphasizing the importance of following orders precisely and avoiding any deviation from the prescribed flight path. When Sullivan pressed for additional details about potential threats or the specific nature of what he might encounter, Hartley's response was uncharacteristically sharp. Follow orders, maintain radio discipline, and ask no further questions. The Hellcat's engine roared, too, life with mechanical precision. Its 18-cylinder Pratt and Whitney radial power plant generating over 2,000 horsepower. Sullivan performed his standard pre-flight checks with practiced efficiency, testing control surfaces, verifying instrument readings, and confirming communication equipment functionality. The aircraft carried extra fuel tanks that extended its range to nearly 1,400 miles, far more than the prescribed mission would require. Everything appeared normal, yet an inexplicable sense of unease settled over him like the coastal fog itself. Tower clearance came at precisely 0630 hours, and Sullivan taxied toward the runway as the first hints of dawn painted the eastern sky. The control tower operator's voice crackled through his headset, with routine departure instructions, but Sullivan detected an underlying tension that matched his own growing apprehension. As he advanced the throttle for takeoff, the Hellcat's powerful engine pulled him skyward into what would become one of aviation's most enduring mysteries. The takeoff proceeded without incident, and Sullivan banked northwest along the coastline as instructed. Below him, the California shore stretched like a ribbon between the dark Pacific and the awakening landscape of farms and forests. The flight path took him over the familiar landmarks of San Francisco Bay, past the Golden Gate Bridge shrouded in morning mist, and along the rugged Marin County coastline. Radio traffic was minimal, limited to the predetermined checkpoint communications that confirmed his position and progress. At 0715 hours, he transmitted his first position report, passing Point Reyes, maintaining assigned altitude of 8,000 feet. No unusual observations to report. The second checkpoint came 30 minutes later as he turned inland toward the Russian River Valley, following a route that seemed to serve no apparent reconnaissance purpose. His voice, recorded by base radio, operators remained calm and professional. Base control. Navy 77492 passing checkpoint 2, continuing mission as briefed, weather clear, visibility unlimited. Those would be the last words ever heard from Lieutenant Commander James Robert Sullivan. What happened during the following hour and 17 minutes remained a complete mystery for 8 decades. Sullivan failed to reach checkpoint 3 at the designated time of 0830 hours. When 15 minutes passed without communication, base control attempted to establish radio contact. Their calls went unanswered. By 0900 hours, a full-scale search and rescue operation was underway, involving multiple aircraft, Coast Guard vessels, and ground teams combing the rugged coastline and inland valleys where Sullivan might have gone down. The search continued for 2 weeks, covering thousands of square miles of ocean, forest, and mountainous terrain. Military investigators interviewed every person who might have observed aircraft activity that morning. Radar stations reported tracking Sullivan's Hellcat until approximately 0755 hours, at which point the aircraft signal simply vanished from their screens over the mountainous terrain east of the Russian River. The disappearance occurred in an area where radar coverage was sporadic due to the challenging topography, making it impossible to determine whether the signal loss was due to equipment failure, terrain, masking, or aircraft destruction. No distress calls had been received, no emergency beacons detected, and no wreckage discovered despite the most comprehensive search effort mounted by the Pacific Fleet since the war began. Coast Guard cutters patrolled the offshore waters, while Army Air Force's search planes systematically covered every square mile of the inland search area. Ground teams composed of military personnel, civilian volunteers, and local law enforcement officers combed through dense forests, steep ravines, and remote valleys where an aircraft might crash without being immediately visible from the air. The official incident report, classified at the highest levels and sealed in Navy archives, concluded that Lieutenant Commander Sullivan and his aircraft were presumed lost due to unknown causes. The mission details remained so highly classified that even Sullivan's family was provided only the most basic information. Their son and husband had died in service to his country during a training flight along the California coast. No mention was made of the reconnaissance mission, the mysterious intelligence officers, or the strange circumstances surrounding his disappearance. James Robert Sullivan's story began in the small farming community of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, where he was born on March 22, 1916, to Patrick and Margaret Sullivan. His father operated a successful grain elevator business that served the surrounding agricultural region, while his mother taught elementary school at the local one-room schoolhouse. The youngest of 4 children, James displayed an early fascination with mechanical devices and flying machines that would eventually shape his destiny and lead him toward a career that would intersect with some of the most classified military operations of the Second World War. Growing up during the 1920s and early 30s, young James was captivated by the barnstorming pilots who occasionally visited rural Iowa, performing aerial stunts and offering rides to anyone brave enough to climb into their fabric-covered biplanes. His parents initially viewed this interest as a harmless childhood phase, but James's passion for aviation only intensified as he matured. He spent countless hours reading aviation magazines, building intricate model airplanes with remarkable attention to detail, and dreaming of soaring through the clouds like his heroes Charles Lindbergh and Jimmy Doolittle. Academic achievement came naturally to James, who consistently ranked among the top students in his graduating class despite dividing his attention between studies and mechanical projects. His aptitude for mathematics and physics impressed his teachers, who recognized the analytical mind that would later prove invaluable in military aviation. James's mechanical skills were evident in his ability to repair farm equipment, automobiles, and any mechanical device that neighbors brought to the Sullivan household. These abilities earned him part-time employment at the local Ford dealership while still in high school, where he learned advanced mechanical techniques and developed the troubleshooting skills that would serve him well as a military pilot. The high school years were marked by James's increasing involvement in aviation-related activities. He joined the school's nascent aviation club, where students built and flew model aircraft while studying the principles of flight and navigation. James emerged as a natural leader in these activities, organizing flying competitions and teaching younger students the fundamentals of aerodynamics. His teachers recognized his potential and encouraged him to pursue higher education, leading to his acceptance at Iowa State University with a full academic scholarship that would allow him to pursue his dreams without burdening his family financially. At Iowa State, James majored in mechanical engineering while participating enthusiastically in the university's WWII Emerging Aviation Program. The program, established in partnership with the Civil Aeronautics Administration, provided students with both theoretical knowledge and practical flying experience that was becoming increasingly valuable as the nation began to recognize the importance of aviation in national defense. James excelled in both areas, earning his private pilot's license during his sophomore year and accumulating over 100 flight hours by graduation. His instructors consistently praised his natural flying ability, describing him as intuitive, precise, and exceptionally calm under pressure. The university years also provided James with opportunities to develop his leadership skills and broaden his understanding of the world beyond rural Iowa. He served as president of the Engineering Society, organized volunteer activities in the local community, and maintained academic excellence while working part-time jobs to supplement his scholarship funding. Fellow students remember him as serious but approachable, with a dry sense of humor and an unwavering commitment to helping others succeed. These personal qualities would later make him an effective military leader and earn the respect of the men who served under his command. The attack on Pearl Harbor occurred during James's senior year, fundamentally altering his life plans and those of millions of other young Americans. Rather than pursuing the civilian engineering career he had originally planned, he immediately applied for Navy flight training, motivated by both patriotic duty and his burning desire to serve as a combat pilot in what promised to be the greatest conflict in human history. His academic record, extensive flying experience, and demonstrated leadership qualities made him an ideal candidate for the Navy's accelerated pilot training program that was rapidly expanding to meet wartime demands. Naval flight training began at Pensacola Naval Air Station in February 1942, where James joined hundreds of other young men from across America who shared his determination to serve their country as naval aviators. The program was intensive and demanding, designed to transform civilians into combat-ready aviators in the shortest possible time while maintaining the high standards that naval aviation had established during peacetime. James thrived in this challenging environment, demonstrating exceptional skills in aircraft handling, navigation, gunnery, and formation, flying that marked him as a future combat leader. The training regimen was physically and mentally exhausting, with days that began before dawn and continued well into the evening. Students learned to fly multiple aircraft types, from basic trainers to advanced fighters, while mastering the complex skills needed for carrier operations and combat flying. James's engineering background gave him advantages in understanding aircraft systems and performance characteristics, while his natural flying Ability allowed him to excel in the hands-on aspects of pilot training. His instructors noted his ability to remain focused and analytical even during the most stressful training scenarios, qualities that would prove invaluable in the life-and-death situations he would later face in combat. Upon completing flight training with honors, Ensign James Sullivan was assigned to Fighting Squadron 32, newly equipped with the formidable Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighter that would become the backbone of Navy fighter operations in the Pacific Theater. The squadron deployed to the Pacific in June 1943, initially operating from the carrier USS Yorktown before transitioning to land-based operations in the Marshall Islands as American forces began their inexorable advance toward the Japanese home islands. Sullivan's first combat missions involved escorting bombing raids against Japanese-held atolls, where he quickly established himself as a skilled and dependable pilot who could be counted on to complete any assigned mission regardless of the dangers involved. His combat record was exemplary from the very beginning. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Sullivan shot down 3 Japanese aircraft in a single engagement, demonstrating the tactical skills and aggressive spirit that earned him his first Distinguished Flying Cross. His squadron mates respected his tactical judgment and relied on his steady leadership during the chaotic aerial battles that characterized Pacific Theater combat. Sullivan had an intuitive understanding of aerial tactics and the ability to remain calm under fire, qualities that made him an effective flight leader and earned him rapid promotion through the ranks. The promotion to lieutenant came quickly. Recognition of both his exceptional flying skills and his natural ability to lead other pilots in combat situations where split-second decisions could mean the difference between life and death. Sullivan's flight leaders consistently praised his performance in combat, noting his ability to maintain formation integrity while engaging enemy aircraft and his skill at protecting less experienced pilots during their first combat missions. These leadership qualities, combined with his technical expertise and proven combat effectiveness, marked him as a rising star in naval aviation who was destined for greater responsibilities and more challenging assignments. Between combat deployments, Sullivan returned to California for advanced training and aircraft familiarization programs that kept pace with the rapid technological developments occurring throughout the war. It was during this period that he met and married Catherine Elizabeth Morrison, a Navy nurse stationed at Oakland Naval Hospital, who shared his dedication to serving their country during the war effort. Their courtship was brief but intense, conducted against the backdrop of wartime uncertainty that compressed normal relationship timelines and made every moment together precious and meaningful. They were married on September 8, 1943, in a simple ceremony attended by squadron members and hospital staff who had become their extended family during the uncertain times of war. Catherine later described her husband as thoughtful, dedicated, and quietly confident, with a gentle manner that contrasted with the aggressive skills he displayed as a combat pilot. He rarely spoke about his combat experiences, preferring to focus on their plans for life after the war and the family they hoped to start once peace returned to the world. They discussed returning to Iowa, where James intended to establish an aircraft maintenance business using the skills he had acquired during military service, while Catherine planned to continue nursing as they built their civilian lives together. The couple's time together was necessarily limited by the demands of war and military assignments that kept them separated for months at a time. James's second deployment took him back to the Pacific for operations in the Mariana Islands, where he participated in the invasion of Saipan and subsequent campaigns that brought American forces closer to the Japanese mainland. His second Distinguished Flying Cross came during a mission to protect damaged bombers returning from raids on Japanese positions. Despite being outnumbered and running low on fuel, Sullivan engaged enemy fighters that threatened the vulnerable bombers, shooting down 2 additional aircraft, and enabling all the bombers to reach safety with their crews intact. By late summer 1944, Sullivan had completed his required combat tour and was reassigned to Naval Air Station Alameda for what should have been a period of rest and training duty. The assignment was considered a reward for his distinguished service, offering an opportunity to remain stateside while contributing to pilot training programs and sharing his combat experience with newly trained aviators preparing for their own deployments to the Pacific Theater. Catherine joined him in California, and they rented a small apartment in Oakland, finally able to enjoy something approaching normal married life after months of separation and the constant stress of combat operations. The routine training and administrative duties at Alameda seemed to suit Sullivan perfectly after months of combat stress and the constant danger of aerial combat. Fellow officers described him as relaxed and optimistic about the war's eventual conclusion, with the quiet confidence of someone who had proven himself under fire and earned the right to look forward to peacetime. He wrote regularly to his family in Iowa, describing California's pleasant climate and expressing confidence that he would soon complete his military service and return home to start the civilian life he had postponed for military duty. His final letter, received by his parents 3 days before his disappearance, spoke enthusiastically about civilian flying opportunities and his plans to pursue a commercial pilot's license that would allow him to remain in aviation while building a family business. Catherine's memories of their last evening together would haunt her for the rest of her life, becoming increasingly precious as the years passed, and the mystery of her husband's fate remained unsolved. They had dinner at a small restaurant in Oakland, discussing plans for a delayed honeymoon trip to San Francisco, once James completed his current assignment and could take extended leave. He seemed unusually thoughtful that evening, mentioning that he had been selected for a special mission, but providing no details about its nature or duration. When Catherine pressed for more information, James explained that the mission was classified but appeared routine, involving coastal reconnaissance work that would keep him away for only a few hours and should present no unusual dangers. The morning of October 15th began like any other day during their brief time together in California, with the normal routines of military life and the comfortable domesticity they had finally been able to establish. James rose early for his pre-flight briefing, kissing Catherine goodbye as she prepared for her shift at the hospital where her nursing skills were desperately needed to treat wounded servicemen returning from Pacific Theater operations. His final words to her were typically optimistic and loving. "I'll see you tonight, and we can finish planning that San Francisco trip." She never saw him again, and those words would echo in her memory for the rest of her life. The day Lieutenant Commander Sullivan vanished began in the pre-dawn darkness of Naval Air Station Alameda, where unusual activity had been observed by base personnel throughout the preceding week. Ground crews reported the presence of unfamiliar aircraft on the flight line, civilian vehicles with government license plates in either restricted areas, and an increased security presence that seemed disproportionate to normal training operations. The atmosphere was tense, charged with the kind of secretive urgency that typically preceded major combat operations or highly classified missions that extended beyond routine military activities. At 0400 hours, Sullivan received notification to report for an immediate briefing regarding his morning mission. This timing was unusual, as standard reconnaissance flights were typically briefed the previous evening to allow pilots adequate rest and preparation time. The notification came through irregular channels, delivered by a petty officer who claimed to be acting on direct orders from Squadron Command, but could provide no additional information about the mission's nature or urgency. The unusual procedure was the first indication that this assignment would be different from the routine training flights that had occupied Sullivan's time since his return to stateside duty. The briefing room was unlike any Sullivan had previously encountered at Alameda, located in a basement area of the intelligence building that he had never accessed before. The space was windowless and furnished only with basic military furniture, creating an atmosphere of secrecy that seemed more appropriate for classified operations than routine reconnaissance missions. Present were his squadron commander, Captain Hartley, two intelligence officers he did not recognize, and the two civilian-dressed men whose presence added an air of mystery to the proceedings. No one was introduced beyond their rank or title, and no explanation was provided for the unusual security measures that surrounded this supposedly routine mission. The intelligence briefing itself was remarkably sparse for such an apparently high-priority mission, lacking the detailed information that normally accompanied reconnaissance flights. Sullivan was instructed to fly a specific route northwest from Alameda, passing Point Reyes before turning inland toward the Russian River Valley, maintaining precise altitudes and timing while photographing any ground activity that appeared unusual or out of place. The camera equipment provided was more sophisticated than standard reconnaissance gear, featuring telephoto lenses and specialized film that suggested the mission's importance extended beyond routine coastal surveillance and involved targets that required exceptional image quality. What struck Sullivan as particularly odd were the specific geographical coordinates he was ordered to investigate. Rather than covering a broad coastal area as would be expected for general reconnaissance, his assigned route focused on a narrow corridor inland from Point Reyes, following river valleys and mountainous terrain that seemed strategically unimportant. The coordinates corresponded to an area of dense forest and steep topography that was sparsely inhabited and offered no apparent military significance. When Sullivan questioned the rationale for concentrating on this particular region, he was curtly informed that operational details were classified above his clearance level and that his job was to follow orders without seeking unnecessary explanations. The radio communication protocol was equally unusual and unlike anything Sullivan had encountered during his extensive combat experience. Instead of maintaining regular contact with base control, as was standard procedure for all military flights, Sullivan was instructed to transmit position reports only at 3 predetermined checkpoints, using coded identification numbers rather than standard call signs. Between these checkpoint reports, he was to maintain complete radio silence regardless of what he might observe or encounter during the mission. Emergency communication procedures were modified to require specific authorization codes that Sullivan had never previously used, adding another layer of complexity to what should have been a straightforward reconnaissance mission. Equipment inspection revealed several anomalies that troubled Sullivan, but which he was not permitted to question despite his extensive experience with aircraft modifications and special equipment. His Hellcat carried additional fuel tanks that extended its range far beyond what the prescribed mission route would require, suggesting either that the true mission parameters were different from what he had been told, or that contingencies existed that had not been explained to him. The aircraft's standard armament load was reduced to accommodate specialized camera equipment and what appeared to be electronic monitoring devices whose purpose was not explained and whose operation he was specifically instructed not to investigate. Most concerning was the installation of a transponder system that Sullivan did not recognize, connected to controls that he was specifically instructed not to touch under any circumstances. The equipment appeared to be far more sophisticated than standard navigation aids, with multiple antennas and electronic components that suggested capabilities beyond simple position reporting. When Sullivan inquired about the equipment's purpose and operation, he was told that it was classified electronic gear that would function automatically and required no pilot input. The explanation was unsatisfactory, but attempts to obtain additional information were firmly rebuffed by the intelligence officers present at the briefing. Pre-flight preparation proceeded under unusually tight security, with armed guards restricting access to Sullivan's aircraft and prohibiting normal interaction between ground crews and the pilot. Mechanics who serviced the Hellcat were required to sign additional security agreements and were escorted from the area immediately upon completing their assigned tasks. This level of operational security was typically reserved for missions involving highly classified technology or strategic targets, neither of which seemed relevant to coastal reconnaissance duty. The security measures created an atmosphere of tension and secrecy that was completely inconsistent with routine training operations. The ground crew chief, a veteran mechanic with 20 years of Navy service, later reported that the modifications to Sullivan's aircraft were unlike anything he had encountered during his extensive career. The additional equipment required significant electrical modifications and structural changes that suggested the aircraft was being prepared for purposes far beyond standard reconnaissance work. However, when the chief attempted to discuss the modifications with his superiors, he was ordered to complete the work without questions and to discuss the matter with no one outside the immediate work crew. Weather conditions on the morning of October 15th were ideal for flying, with clear skies, unlimited visibility, and minimal wind conditions that would make navigation and photography simple and straightforward. The Pacific high-pressure system had stabilized over the region, creating the kind of perfect flying weather that pilots dream about, and that would make any mechanical failure or navigational difficulties immediately apparent. These excellent conditions would make Sullivan's subsequent disappearance even more puzzling, as there were no environmental factors that could explain mechanical failure, spatial disorientation, or the navigational difficulties that sometimes led to aircraft losses. The coastal fog that typically plagued the region during morning hours had lifted early, providing clear visibility from the surface to well above Sullivan's assigned altitude. Winds were light and variable, creating smooth flying conditions that would allow precise navigation and high-quality photography. Weather stations throughout Northern California reported similar conditions, with no adverse weather phenomena anywhere along Sullivan's planned route. The meteorological conditions were so favorable that weather-related aircraft loss could be ruled out as a factor in Sullivan's disappearance. Takeoff occurred precisely on schedule at 0630 hours, with Sullivan's Hellcat lifting off from Alameda's main runway and turning northwest toward the assigned operational area. Tower controllers tracked the aircraft's initial progress using standard radar equipment, noting normal airspeed, altitude, and heading as Sullivan followed the prescribed route along the California coastline. Radio communication functioned properly during the early phases of flight, with clear transmission quality and appropriate responses to ground control instructions. Everything appeared routine during the first phase of the mission. The flight path took Sullivan over familiar territory that he had covered during previous training flights, passing over San Francisco Bay and the Golden Gate Bridge before following the Marin County coastline toward Point Reyes. The route was well within the operating area normally used for training flights, making navigation simple and eliminating any possibility of confusion about geographical landmarks or navigational references. Sullivan's experience with the area and the excellent weather conditions should have made this portion of the flight completely routine. Ground observers along the coast reported seeing a single military aircraft flying northwest at the approximate time of Sullivan's passage, confirming that his mission proceeded normally through the initial phase. A lighthouse keeper at Point Reyes noted the distinctive sound of a single-engine fighter aircraft passing overhead at what he estimated to be medium altitude, consistent with Sullivan's assigned flight parameters. These observations confirmed that Sullivan had successfully reached his first checkpoint and was continuing the mission as briefed. The first checkpoint report arrived exactly on time at 07:15 hours, confirming Sullivan's position over Point Reyes and his continued progress toward the operational area. His voice transmission was recorded by base radio operators and later analyzed extensively by investigators searching for any indication of problems or unusual circumstances. The recording revealed no signs of stress, mechanical difficulty, or concern about the mission parameters. Sullivan's tone was professional and calm, consistent with routine mission operations, and showing no awareness of any developing problems. The turn inland toward the Russian River Valley marked the beginning of the portion of Sullivan's flight that would lead to his mysterious disappearance. This phase of the mission took him away from the coastal areas where ground observers might witness any unusual occurrences and into the mountainous terrain where radar coverage was sporadic and radio communication could be affected by topographical interference. The route followed river, valleys, and mountain ridges that were sparsely populated and seldom traversed by aircraft, creating conditions where unusual events might occur without witnesses. Ground observers in the Russian River Valley area reported hearing aircraft engines during the appropriate time period, but the mountainous terrain and dense forest cover made visual confirmation difficult. A forest ranger stationed near Gurneville reported the sound of a single-engine aircraft flying inland from the coast, following the river valley toward the mountainous interior. The timing of this observation corresponded with Sullivan's planned route, confirming that his mission continued to proceed normally through the second phase of his flight. The second checkpoint report, transmitted at 07:45 hours, would be the last confirmed communication from Sullivan's aircraft. Base radio logs recorded his position as being over the designated coordinates inland from the coast, maintaining assigned altitude and continuing the mission as briefed. Signal strength was strong and clear, with no indication of equipment problems or environmental interference that might affect communication or navigation systems. Sullivan's voice remained calm and professional, showing no signs of distress or concern about his situation. What happened during the 33 minutes following that final radio transmission became the central mystery of the entire incident. Radar contact with Sullivan's aircraft was lost at approximately 08:18 hours, when his transponder signal simply vanished from ground control displays. The loss of radar contact occurred over mountainous terrain where signal interference was common, initially causing no immediate alarm among radar operators who assumed the aircraft would reappear as it cleared the terrain and returned to areas with better radar coverage. The mountainous terrain east of the Russian River Valley was known for creating radar shadows and communication, dead zones that could temporarily isolate aircraft from ground control. Pilots flying in the area were accustomed to brief periods without radio contact, and radar operators were familiar with aircraft signals disappearing and reappearing as aircraft maneuvered through the complex topography. The initial loss of contact with Sullivan's aircraft was therefore treated as routine, with no immediate concern about his safety or mission status. When Sullivan failed to transmit his third checkpoint report at 08:30 hours, Base Control attempted to establish radio contact using standard communication procedures. The initial calls were routine, as missed checkpoint reports sometimes occurred due to radio problems, pilot distraction, or minor navigational difficulties that caused timing discrepancies. However, when these calls went unanswered, despite clear atmospheric conditions and proper equipment function on the ground, concern began to grow among control tower personnel, who recognized that something unusual was occurring. 15 minutes of unsuccessful radio contact attempts triggered emergency protocols that had been established for missing aircraft incidents. The procedures called for expanding communication attempts to include all available radio frequencies and emergency channels, while simultaneously alerting search and rescue organizations about the potential aircraft emergency. Base commanders were notified of the situation, and preliminary search plans were activated to prepare for immediate deployment of rescue assets if the aircraft could not be located through continued radio contact attempts. The massive search effort that followed Sullivan's disappearance represented one of the most intensive aircraft search operations ever conducted by Pacific Fleet forces during the Second World War. Within 2 hours of the missed radio contact, search aircraft from multiple bases were systematically combing the suspected crash area, while Coast Guard vessels began patrolling the coastal waters where Sullivan might have gone down if he had attempted to return to base and crashed in the ocean. Ground teams composed of military personnel and civilian volunteers started searching the rugged terrain of Mendocino and Sonoma counties, focusing on areas where aircraft wreckage might be concealed by dense forest canopy or steep terrain. Search operations continued around the clock for 14 days, expanding to cover thousands of square miles of ocean, forest, and mountainous terrain that might contain evidence of Sullivan's fate. Military investigators interviewed hundreds of potential witnesses, analyzed every piece of radar data, and examined weather records for any factor that might explain Sullivan's disappearance. Despite the exhaustive effort and the most advanced search techniques available in 1944, no trace of the missing pilot or his aircraft was ever discovered, creating a mystery that would persist for 8 decades. The official investigation into Lieutenant Commander Sullivan's disappearance was conducted under extraordinary security measures that far exceeded normal procedures for missing aircraft incidents. Led by a joint team of Navy investigators and civilian intelligence officers whose credentials extended far beyond normal military channels, the investigation was classified at levels typically reserved for the most sensitive wartime secrets. Personnel involved in the investigation were required to sign extensive non-disclosure agreements that prohibited them from discussing any aspect of the case with unauthorized persons, and all findings were sealed in classified archives that would remain inaccessible for decades. Investigation team members were selected based on their security clearances and prior experience with sensitive military matters, rather than their expertise in aircraft accident investigation. This unusual staffing decision suggested that the investigation's primary concern was protecting classified information rather than determining the actual cause of Sullivan's disappearance. Traditional accident investigators were excluded from the process despite their superior qualifications for analyzing aircraft incidents, indicating that the case involved factors beyond normal aviation safety concerns. The investigators' first priority was interviewing every person who had any contact with Sullivan or knowledge of his final mission, but the questioning focused more on maintaining secrecy than gathering factual information about the circumstances of his disappearance. Base personnel, including ground crews, mechanics, radio operators, and intelligence officers, were subjected to intensive interrogation that emphasized their obligations to maintain security rather than their potential contributions to understanding what had happened to the missing pilot. Many interviewees later reported feeling that they were being treated as potential security risks rather than helpful witnesses to a tragic accident. Captain Hartley, Sullivan's squadron commander, was questioned extensively about the mission's classification and operational details, but the investigation records suggest that Hartley himself was not fully informed about the mission's true purpose or the identity of the civilian intelligence officers who had organized it. His testimony revealed frustration with the unusual command structure and his exclusion from normal mission planning processes, indicating that the operation was controlled by agencies outside the standard Navy chain of command. Hartley's responses showed that even senior military officers were kept in the dark about the true nature of Sullivan's assignment. Ground radar stations that had tracked Sullivan's flight were required to surrender all recording equipment and documentation to the investigation team immediately after the search was called off. Radar operators were questioned intensively about their observations and ordered to destroy any personal notes or records related to the incident. The radar data itself was classified and removed from normal Navy archives, making it unavailable to subsequent investigators or researchers attempting to understand the circumstances of Sullivan's disappearance. This unusual treatment of routine operational data suggested that Sullivan's flight had involved activities that required extraordinary protection. The investigation team devoted considerable effort to examining Sullivan's background, personal relationships, and potential motivations for deliberate disappearance, despite the complete absence of evidence suggesting such possibilities. This line of inquiry seemed inappropriate for what should have been a straightforward accident investigation, suggesting that investigators suspected Sullivan might have intentionally deviated from his mission, or somehow become involved in activities that would require concealment from his own military superiors. Such suspicions were completely inconsistent with Sullivan's exemplary service record and the testimony of everyone who knew him personally. Catherine Sullivan was subjected to particularly intensive questioning about her husband's mental state, political beliefs, and any unusual behavior preceding his disappearance. Investigators seemed especially interested in determining whether Sullivan had expressed any doubts about the war effort, dissatisfaction with military service, or unusual interest in political matters that might suggest disloyalty or security risks. Catherine later described these interviews as hostile and insulting, with investigators implying that her husband might have been a traitor or deserter, despite his distinguished combat record and his obvious dedication to his military duties. The personal investigation extended to Sullivan's family in Iowa, with agents interviewing his parents, siblings, and childhood friends about his character, political views, and any indication that he might have been susceptible to enemy influence or recruitment. These investigations were conducted under the pretext of routine security inquiries, but the intensity and scope of the questioning suggested that serious doubts existed about Sullivan's loyalty and motivations. Family members were bewildered by the implications and deeply hurt by suggestions that their son and brother might have been anything other than a dedicated American serviceman. Physical evidence collection was hampered by the remote location where Sullivan's aircraft had presumably crashed, and the investigation team's apparent lack of expertise in aircraft accident analysis. Search teams focused on recovering wreckage that might contain classified equipment, rather than determining the cause of the crash through systematic examination of debris patterns and impact evidence. This priority led to superficial examination of potential crash sites and inadequate analysis of the few pieces of debris that were discovered during the extensive search operation. The few pieces of metal and fabric found during the search were subjected to extensive laboratory analysis, but the results were never shared with normal accident investigation procedures or incorporated into standard safety recommendations that might prevent similar incidents. Instead, all physical evidence was classified and removed from normal investigative channels, suggesting that the debris might have revealed information about classified equipment or mission parameters that required protection. The unusual treatment of physical evidence prevented normal accident analysis procedures and contributed to the continuing mystery surrounding Sullivan's fate. Witness interviews revealed a pattern of unusual military activity in the area where Sullivan disappeared, but this information was not incorporated into the official findings or used to develop theories about what might have happened to the missing aircraft. Local residents reported seeing heavy trucks and construction equipment in remote forest areas where no legitimate projects were known to exist, while law enforcement officers recalled being instructed to avoid certain areas during the time period of Sullivan's disappearance. These reports suggested that classified activities were occurring in the region, but investigators showed no interest in pursuing these leads. The investigation's conclusions were as mysterious as the incident itself, providing no meaningful explanation for Sullivan's disappearance, while emphasizing the classified nature of his mission and the security requirements that surrounded the case. The final report, classified and sealed immediately upon completion, officially attributed Sullivan's disappearance to unknown causes during execution of classified reconnaissance mission, without making any determination regarding mechanical failure, pilot error, weather conditions, or other factors that might have contributed to the incident. This conclusion satisfied no one and answered none of the questions raised by the mysterious circumstances. The report's recommendations were entirely focused on improving security procedures rather than preventing similar accidents or addressing the aviation safety issues that might have been revealed by proper accident investigation. The emphasis on security over safety suggested that the investigation's real purpose was protecting classified information, rather than learning from Sullivan's disappearance to improve military aviation safety. This priority prevented the case from contributing to the body of knowledge that normally results from aircraft accident investigations. Family members and squadron personnel were provided with minimal information about the investigation's findings, creating lasting resentment and suspicion about the military's handling of the case. Sullivan was declared officially dead 6 months after his disappearance, but his family was never informed about the classified nature of his final mission or the unusual circumstances surrounding the investigation. This secrecy prevented normal grieving processes and left lingering questions that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives, while creating lasting distrust of official explanations for military incidents. The investigation team's final actions demonstrated that protecting classified information was considered more important than providing closure to grieving families or contributing to aviation safety knowledge. All documentation was sealed in high-security archives with classification levels that would prevent access for decades, while investigation team members were reassigned to different bases and sworn to permanent secrecy about their involvement in the case. Personnel who had participated in the search were transferred or discharged from military service, eliminating potential sources of future information about the case and ensuring that institutional memory of the incident would be lost over time. The decades following Lieutenant Commander Sullivan's disappearance were marked by official silence, bureaucratic stonewalling, and the gradual fading of memories as those who knew him grew old and died. The Navy maintained strict classification of all documents related to his final mission, deflecting inquiries from family members, journalists, and researchers with standard responses about national security requirements and ongoing classified operations. This wall of secrecy only deepened the mystery and fueled speculation about what had really happened during those missing minutes over the mountains of Northern California. Catherine Sullivan's efforts to learn the truth about her husband's fate consumed much of her remaining life, becoming an obsession that affected her subsequent relationships and her ability to achieve closure about the tragedy. Despite remarrying in 1951 to a kind man who understood her need to continue searching for answers, and raising 3 children who grew up knowing about their stepfather's mysterious predecessor, she never stopped seeking information about James's disappearance. Her correspondence with Navy officials, carefully preserved in family papers, reveals a pattern of polite responses that provided no meaningful information while maintaining the fiction that national security considerations prevented disclosure of relevant details. In 1954, Catherine hired a private investigator named Robert Chen, a former FBI agent who specialized in military cases and had developed contacts throughout the defense establishment during his government service. Chen's investigation uncovered several intriguing leads that seemed to point toward unusual military activities in the Mendocino area during October 1944. a logging crew that had been working in the mountains reported seeing heavy trucks and earth-moving equipment in remote forest areas where no legitimate construction projects were known to exist, while workers described military personnel restricting access to certain areas without explanation. Chen's most significant discovery was a partially burned document found in a trash barrel behind an abandoned military facility near Ukiah, California, which had been used for storage and training purposes during the war years. The document fragment appeared to be part of an operations order referring to Project Redwood and containing geographical coordinates that closely matched Sullivan's assigned reconnaissance route. The document also contained references to experimental aircraft evaluation and German technology assessment, suggesting that Sullivan's mission had involved something far more complex than routine reconnaissance work. However, when Chen attempted to pursue this lead through official channels and contacted former military personnel who might have knowledge about Project Redwood, he was visited by federal agents who confiscated his files and issued clear warnings against continuing his investigation. The agents identified themselves as being from unspecified government agencies and made it clear that further inquiry into the matter would result in serious legal consequences for both Chen and his client. The threat was implicit but unmistakable. Some aspects of the Second World War remained too sensitive for civilian investigation, even a decade after the conflict's end. The WWII 1960s brought new developments, as a generation of investigative journalists began challenging government secrecy and questioning official narratives about wartime operations that had been accepted without scrutiny during the patriotic fervor of the war years. Several prominent reporters attempted to investigate Sullivan's disappearance as part of broader examinations of classified military programs that might have involved questionable activities or represented misuse of government resources. However, their efforts were consistently thwarted by the same wall of official silence that had frustrated earlier inquiries, with government officials citing ongoing national security concerns that prevented disclosure of information from the 1940s. Freedom of Information Act requests filed by journalists and researchers were routinely denied on national security grounds, with officials arguing that disclosure of information about Sullivan's mission would reveal intelligence capabilities and operational methods that remained relevant to contemporary military operations. This reasoning seemed increasingly strained as time passed, and the technology of the 1940s became obsolete. But government agencies maintained their position that certain wartime secrets would remain classified indefinitely. The persistence of this secrecy began to generate suspicion that the case involved more than routine military operations. Aviation enthusiasts and amateur historians kept interest in the case alive through articles in specialty magazines and presentations at airshow gatherings where veterans shared stories about unusual wartime experiences. These informal investigations produced numerous theories about Sullivan's fate, ranging from mechanical failure in remote terrain to involvement in secret weapons testing programs that might have been based on captured German technology. Some researchers speculated that Sullivan had been conducting surveillance related to suspected German submarine activity along the Pacific coast, while others suggested that he might have been involved in testing experimental aircraft that were too classified for normal military channels. However, none of these theories could be verified without access to classified records that remained firmly sealed in government archives. The few researchers who possessed appropriate security clearances and attempted to access relevant documents were denied permission, suggesting that the case involved agencies or programs that extended beyond normal military operations and into areas that remained sensitive decades after the original events. The continuing classification suggested that Sullivan's mission had touched on matters that government officials considered permanently sensitive. The Cold War era brought additional complications to any investigation of wartime mysteries, as government agencies became even more secretive about historical operations that might reveal intelligence capabilities or operational methods still in use against the Soviet Union. The Sullivan case was effectively buried under layers of classification and bureaucratic protection that made meaningful research virtually impossible, even for historians and researchers with appropriate security clearances. The case became symbolic of the broader trend toward government secrecy that characterized American intelligence operations during the confrontation with communism. Family. Interest in the case continued through subsequent generations, with Sullivan's nephews and nieces growing up with family stories about their mysterious uncle and occasionally attempting their own investigations as they reached adulthood. In 1978, his nephew Michael Sullivan, who had become a lawyer specializing in government accountability issues, filed a comprehensive Freedom of Information Act lawsuit demanding release of all documents related to his uncle's disappearance. The legal battle represented the most serious challenge to the government's secrecy about the case, but it ultimately proved unsuccessful after 6 years of litigation. The lawsuit dragged through federal courts for years before being dismissed on national security grounds, with judges accepting government arguments that disclosure would harm ongoing intelligence operations despite the passage of more than 3 decades since the original incident. The court's reasoning reflected the broader, judicial deference to executive branch claims about national security that characterized the Cold War period. But it also suggested that the Sullivan case involved genuinely sensitive matters that extended beyond routine military operations. The legal defeat effectively ended family efforts to obtain official disclosure of relevant information. The 1980s and 90s saw renewed interest in World War II mysteries as classified documents from other wartime programs began to be declassified and released to the public under new policies designed to promote historical transparency. Researchers hoped that Sullivan's case might be included in these releases, particularly as the government began acknowledging previously secret programs involving captured German technology and experimental aircraft development. However, the documents related to Project Redwood and Sullivan's disappearance remained stubbornly classified, with officials maintaining that disclosure would continue to harm national security interests. The few references to Project Redwood that appeared in other declassified materials were so heavily redacted as to provide no useful information about the program's purpose, scope, or connection to Sullivan's disappearance. These fragmentary references confirmed that Project Redwood had existed and had involved classified military activities. But they revealed nothing about what Sullivan had been doing or why his mission had ended in mysterious circumstances. The continued redaction of references to the project suggested that it remained sensitive to contemporary government operations. Advances in computer technology and Internet communication during the 1990s allowed researchers to share information more effectively and coordinate their investigations across geographical boundaries. Online forums dedicated to aviation mysteries attracted participants from around the world, some with access to international archives or family documents that shed new light on wartime operations that had been conducted in cooperation with foreign governments. However, the Sullivan case remained frustratingly opaque, with no significant new information emerging despite the efforts of dedicated researchers who pooled their resources and expertise. The international research efforts revealed that several Allied nations had conducted similar programs involving captured German technology during the immediate post-war period, suggesting that Project Redwood might have been part of a broader international effort to acquire and exploit German scientific advances before they could be captured by the Soviet Union. However, foreign archives contained no references to American programs or personnel, indicating that Project Redwood had been conducted with extraordinary secrecy that prevented even Allied governments from learning about its activities. The turn of the 21st century brought hope that changing political attitudes and the passage of time might finally allow disclosure of Second World War secrets that no longer posed genuine security risks to the United States. Several high-profile cases resulted in the declassification of previously protected documents, including information about intelligence operations, experimental weapons programs, and cooperation with former enemy scientists that had been considered too sensitive for disclosure during the Cold War period. These developments encouraged Sullivan's remaining family members to renew their efforts to learn the truth about their relatives' fate. However, their renewed requests for information continued to be denied, with officials citing ongoing intelligence concerns and the need to protect sources and methods that somehow remained sensitive after more than 60 years. The reasoning seemed increasingly implausible as the participants in wartime programs died of old age and the technology of the 1940s became museum pieces. But government agencies maintained their position that certain aspects of Project Redwood required permanent protection. The persistence of this secrecy began to generate conspiracy theories about what Sullivan's mission might have involved. Technology advances during the early 2000s enabled more sophisticated analysis of the limited evidence available about Sullivan's disappearance. Digital enhancement of radar records and witness statements revealed previously unnoticed details, while satellite imagery allowed researchers to examine potential crash sites with unprecedented precision. Ground-penetrating radar and metal detection equipment became available to civilian researchers, enabling systematic searches of areas where Sullivan's aircraft might have crashed without being immediately visible from the ground or air. Despite these technological advantages and the dedication of researchers who spent thousands of hours searching remote areas of northern California, no trace of the missing Hellcat was discovered. The negative results suggested either that the aircraft had been completely destroyed in a crash, had come down in an area that had not been searched, or had somehow been removed from the crash site by unknown parties. Each possibility raised additional questions about the circumstances of Sullivan's disappearance and the continuing government secrecy surrounding the case. Professional historians studying the Second World War period occasionally encountered tantalizing references to Sullivan's case in other classified documents, but always in heavily redacted contexts that revealed nothing useful about the circumstances of his disappearance. These fragmentary references confirmed that the case remained active in government archives and that decisions about classification were being regularly reviewed and maintained by contemporary officials. The continuing attention to a 60-year-old case suggested that it involved matters that remained relevant to current government operations. The references also indicated that Sullivan's disappearance was connected to other classified programs that had involved experimental aircraft development, German technology acquisition, and secret cooperation between military services and civilian intelligence agencies. The pattern suggested a complex web of classified activities during the final years of World War II that had remained hidden from public view and continued to require protection from disclosure. The scope of these programs appeared to be far larger than anything that had been publicly acknowledged about American wartime research and development efforts. By the early 2000s, most of the original participants in Sullivan's story had died, taking their knowledge with them to their graves and eliminating potential sources of information about the circumstances of his disappearance. Catherine Sullivan passed away in 1998 without ever learning what had happened to her first husband, dying with unanswered questions that had haunted her for more than 5 decades. Captain Hartley died in 1985, reportedly taking significant secrets about wartime operations to his grave, and refusing to discuss classified matters even with his own family members. The few surviving veterans who might have possessed relevant knowledge about Project Redwood or Sullivan's final mission were either unwilling or unable to discuss the case, citing oaths of secrecy that they considered binding for life or suffering from failing memory that made their recollections unreliable. Some veterans hinted that they possessed information about unusual wartime activities but felt constrained by security obligations that prevented them from sharing their knowledge even decades after the events. Their reluctance to speak suggested that Project Redwood had involved genuinely sensitive matters that participants continued to consider classified. The enduring mystery of Lieutenant Commander Sullivan's disappearance had become a symbol of government secrecy and the tension between national security requirements and the public's right to know about historical events. Academic conferences and freedom of information advocacy groups regularly cited the case as an example of excessive classification that served no legitimate contemporary security interest while preventing historical understanding and family closure. However, these protests had no practical effect on the government's determination to maintain secrecy about whatever Sullivan had been doing during his final flight over Northern California. As the 70th anniversary of Sullivan's disappearance approached in 2014, family members made one final attempt to obtain disclosure of relevant documents through a comprehensive petition that emphasized the humanitarian aspects of the case and the lack of any reasonable security justification for continuing classification after 7 decades. Their petition, supported by numerous veterans organizations and historical societies, argued that no legitimate security interest could justify continued protection of information about events that had occurred before most Americans were born. The government's response was unchanged despite the passage of time and the compelling humanitarian arguments presented by Sullivan's family. Officials maintained that national security considerations required continued protection of the information regardless of the personal cost to family members seeking closure or the historical value of the information to researchers studying wartime programs. The response suggested that Project Redwood had involved matters that government officials considered permanently sensitive, extending beyond the normal classification periods that applied to most military operations. The mystery seemed destined to remain unsolved forever, another casualty of government secrecy and the inexorable passage of time that had eliminated most sources of information about the case. Those who remembered Sullivan personally were gone. The physical evidence had long since deteriorated or been concealed beyond discovery, and official records remained locked away in high-security archives that seemed unlikely ever to be opened. The case appeared to be heading for permanent obscurity, remembered only by aviation enthusiasts and conspiracy theorists whose speculation could never substitute for documented facts about what had really happened. Yet, the story was far from over. Unknown to researchers, family members, and government officials who continued to guard the secrets of Project Redwood, Sullivan's Hellcat and the answers to 8 decades of questions were waiting to be discovered in a location that no one had ever thought to search. The revelation would come not from official disclosure or investigative breakthrough, but from an accidental discovery by urban explorers seeking something entirely different in the rugged mountains of Northern California. The discovery that would finally solve the mystery of Lieutenant Commander Sullivan's disappearance began with an unrelated project undertaken by a group of urban exploration enthusiasts from the San Francisco Bay Area who specialized in documenting abandoned military installations and forgotten historical sites. In March 2024, exactly 80 years after Sullivan's final flight, 4 friends decided to investigate reports of abandoned Cold War facilities hidden in the remote mountains of Mendocino County. Their goal was to document defensive installations that had been constructed in secret during the early Cold War period and later abandoned as strategic priorities changed and new technologies made the facilities obsolete. The group consisted of Marcus Chen, a software engineer and amateur historian who had developed expertise in researching military installations through declassified documents and satellite imagery. Sarah Rodriguez, a professional photographer specializing in abandoned places whose work had been featured in numerous exhibitions and publications. David Kim, a former Army engineer with extensive knowledge of military construction techniques and facility design, and Jessica Thompson, a freelance journalist with connections to veterans organizations and experience investigating government secrecy. They had been exploring abandoned military sites throughout California for 3 years, documenting forgotten installations and researching their historical significance through careful archival work and interviews with former personnel. Their previous discoveries had included radar stations from the Nike missile program, abandoned communication facilities from the Cold War period, and training camps that had been used during World War II before being quietly decommissioned and left to deteriorate in remote locations. The team's work had been featured in photography exhibitions focusing on the forgotten infrastructure of American military history, while their research had contributed to historical preservation efforts and academic studies of Cold War defensive systems. Their reputation for thorough documentation and respect for historical sites had earned them cooperation from veterans groups and occasional unofficial assistance from former military personnel. Initial research for their Mendocino expedition relied on declassified Cold War documents obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, geological surveys that might reveal evidence of construction in remote areas, and aerial photography dating from the 1950s through the 1980s that showed changes in terrain that might indicate human activity. They were specifically searching for evidence of defensive installations that might have been built during the early Cold War period, when military planners feared Soviet attack on West Coast targets and constructed numerous facilities designed to provide early warning and defensive capabilities against potential invasion. The remote mountains of Mendocino County seemed like logical locations for secret radar stations, communication facilities, or even missile sites that might have been constructed during the height of Cold War tensions and later abandoned as new technologies made them obsolete. The area's rugged terrain and sparse population would have provided ideal conditions for classified military installations, while its proximity to the coast would have made it strategically valuable for monitoring potential threats from the Pacific Ocean. The team's research had identified several promising locations where aerial photography showed geometric patterns or cleared areas that suggested human construction rather than natural formations. One particularly intriguing site was located in a narrow valley approximately 30 miles inland from the coast, accessible only by logging roads that had been abandoned for decades and were now barely passable due to landslides and overgrowth. Satellite imagery showed what appeared to be concrete structures partially concealed by forest growth, suggesting installations that had been abandoned long enough for vegetation to begin reclaiming the area. The site's remote location and the apparent age of the structures made it an ideal target for the team's documentation efforts. Historical research revealed that the area had been designated as restricted military land during World War II and had remained off-limits to civilian access until the 1970s, when it was quietly transferred to the Forest Service without any public explanation of its previous military use. The lengthy period of military control suggested that significant activities had occurred in the area, while the secretive transfer to civilian management indicated that the military had wanted to distance itself from whatever had taken place there. These factors made the site particularly interesting to the exploration team. Access to the target location required careful planning and specialized equipment for what promised to be a challenging hike through dense forest and steep terrain that had deterred previous visitors. The team packed gear including metal detectors for locating buried structures, ground-penetrating radar for identifying underground facilities, and professional photography, equipment for documenting whatever they might find. Their preparation included extensive research into the area's topography and history, as well as contingency plans for emergency situations that might arise in such remote terrain. The journey to the site required most of their first day, following animal trails and old logging roads that were barely passable after decades of neglect and natural deterioration. The terrain was steep and rugged, covered by dense redwood and Douglas fir forest that filtered sunlight into a perpetual twilight atmosphere even during midday hours. Navigation required constant reference to GPS devices and topographical maps, as traditional landmarks were obscured by the thick forest canopy and the area's complex topographical features that made visual navigation virtually impossible. Their first significant discovery was a concrete structure partially buried by decades of landslides and completely overgrown with vegetation that had made it nearly invisible from any distance. Initial examination revealed it to be a sophisticated ventilation shaft for some kind of underground facility, with metal gratings and ductwork that suggested environmental control systems far more advanced than typical military installations of the World War II era. The construction appeared to date from the 1940s based on the concrete's composition and the style of metalwork, making it older than the Cold War installations they had originally been seeking. The ventilation system's sophistication suggested that it had been designed to support long-term underground operations rather than simple storage or temporary shelter. The engineering quality was exceptional, with corrosion-resistant materials and design features that indicated considerable investment in creating a facility capable of operating under extreme conditions. The discovery was intriguing but not unprecedented, as many World War II military facilities had been constructed in remote locations for security reasons and later abandoned when their strategic purpose ended. Ground-penetrating radar revealed that the ventilation shaft was connected to a much larger underground complex that extended deep into the mountainside in multiple directions. The radar signatures suggested multiple chambers and corridors carved from solid rock, indicating a construction project far more ambitious than typical military installations of any era. The size and complexity of the EB underground facility suggested it had been designed for long-term occupation by a substantial number of personnel rather than temporary wartime use, raising questions about its original purpose and the enormous resources that would have been required for its construction. Further exploration of the surface area revealed additional features that had been concealed by decades of forest growth and natural camouflage. Careful excavation exposed concrete blast doors designed to withstand tremendous explosive forces, emergency exits that had been carefully concealed but remained functional, and what appeared to be vehicle access ramps leading underground at angles that would allow large trucks or specialized equipment to enter the facility. The engineering quality was exceptional throughout, with reinforced construction that had survived 80 years of weather and seismic activity without significant structural deterioration. The facility had clearly been designed to withstand direct attack and remain operational under extreme conditions that might include conventional bombing or even nuclear attack. The blast-resistant construction and multiple redundant systems suggested that it had been intended for use during prolonged conflicts where surface facilities might be destroyed or compromised. The level of protection and the sophisticated engineering indicated that the facility had been designed to house something of extraordinary value or importance to the war effort. The breakthrough discovery came when David Kim located a partially concealed entrance that had been damaged by a fallen tree, creating a gap large enough for human access that had previously been completely sealed. The entrance led to a concrete tunnel that descended into the mountainside at a steep angle, with emergency lighting fixtures and ventilation ducts that confirmed the facility had been designed for extended underground operations by personnel who might need to remain below ground for extended periods. Armed with powerful flashlights and safety equipment, the team began their descent into what would prove to be one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in modern American military history. The main tunnel extended approximately 200 feet into the mountain before opening into a vast underground chamber carved from solid rock, with precision that suggested the use of advanced excavation techniques. The chamber was roughly circular, approximately 150 feet in diameter and 30 feet high, with multiple corridors branching off in different directions like spokes on a wheel. Emergency lighting systems, though no longer functional after 8 decades, were still mounted throughout the facility in configurations that suggested it had been designed for round-the-clock operations requiring artificial illumination. The construction quality and attention to detail throughout the facility indicated a project that had consumed enormous resources and required years of secret work by skilled engineers and construction crews. Every surface showed evidence of careful planning and execution, with drainage systems, ventilation networks, and electrical conduits that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of underground construction challenges. The facility represented a level of engineering achievement that seemed far beyond anything that would have been justified by routine military requirements. As the team explored the various corridors and chambers that branched off from the main area, they began to understand the facility's true scope and the extraordinary level of self-sufficiency that had been built into its design. They discovered sleeping quarters designed to accommodate dozens of personnel in relative comfort, a fully equipped medical facility with surgical capabilities, communications equipment rooms with sophisticated radio and telephone systems, and extensive storage areas that had been built to support long-term occupation, even if the facility was completely cut off from outside supply lines. The facility appeared to be completely self-sufficient in every respect, with its own power generation systems, water supply and purification equipment, waste disposal systems, and food storage areas that could have supported extended operations without any external assistance. Everything about the design suggested an installation that had been created to remain operational for months, or even years if necessary, far exceeding the requirements of any known military installation from the World War II period. The level of preparation suggested that the facility had been designed for use during conflicts that might isolate it from normal military supply chains. The most stunning discovery came when they entered what was clearly the facility's main operational area, an enormous underground hangar that was easily large enough to house multiple aircraft simultaneously. The chamber was equipped with overhead crane systems for aircraft maintenance, sophisticated ventilation systems for managing engine exhaust, and specialized lighting that would allow detailed work on aircraft systems. The hangar's size and equipment clearly indicated that it had been designed specifically for aircraft operations rather than simple storage. In the center of this underground hangar sat a perfectly preserved Grumman F-6F Hellcat, bearing the tail number 77492, the exact aircraft that Lieutenant Commander James Robert Sullivan had been flying on his final mission 80 years earlier. The sight was so unexpected and so perfectly preserved that the exploration team initially thought they might be experiencing some kind of hallucination or trick of the lighting. The aircraft appeared exactly as it would have looked in 1944, with paint scheme and markings that showed no signs of deterioration despite 8 decades underground. The Hellcat was completely intact, showing absolutely no signs of crash damage, fire, or any of the destruction that would be expected from an aircraft accident. The landing gear was properly positioned, all control surfaces remained properly aligned, engine cowlings showed no impact damage, and the cockpit appeared ready for immediate use. Someone had clearly taken extraordinary care to preserve the aircraft in perfect condition. treating it more like a museum display than abandoned military equipment. Initial examination revealed that the aircraft had not crashed at this location but had been deliberately landed and stored in the underground facility with meticulous attention to preservation. All fluid systems had been properly drained and preserved, exposed metal surfaces had been treated with protective coatings, and the entire aircraft had been positioned and maintained as if it might be needed for future use. The preservation effort had been so successful that the aircraft appeared capable of returning to flight status, with minimal restoration work. The discovery raised immediate and profound questions about how the aircraft had reached the underground facility, and why it had been hidden there for 8 decades without any record of its location in official files. The hangar's access tunnels appeared too small for the Hellcat to have entered in its current assembled configuration, suggesting either that the aircraft had been completely disassembled and reconstructed underground, or that alternative access routes existed that the exploration team had not yet discovered. Either possibility indicated a level of planning and resource commitment that far exceeded anything associated with routine military operations. Examination of the aircraft's interior revealed additional mysteries that deepened rather than resolved questions about Sullivan's fate. His personal flight gear remained in the cockpit exactly as he would have left it, including his leather jacket, helmet, and personal effects that had been carefully arranged as if he had just stepped away from the aircraft temporarily rather than disappearing forever. His flight log was still clipped to the instrument panel, with entries showing normal mission progress up to the point where he had transmitted his final radio message to base control. Nothing in the cockpit suggested emergency conditions, mechanical problems, or any of the circumstances that might have forced an unplanned landing in the remote mountains. All instruments were properly configured, fuel gauges showed adequate reserves for completing the assigned mission, and there were no indications of the equipment malfunctions that sometimes forced aircraft to divert to alternative landing sites. The aircraft appeared to have been deliberately flown to this location rather than forced down by emergency circumstances. The underground facility contained extensive documentation that began to illuminate the mystery of Sullivan's disappearance and reveal the true nature of his final mission. File cabinets throughout the complex were filled with operational orders, technical manuals, personnel records, and correspondence that revealed the installation had been constructed as part of a highly classified program codenamed Project Redwood. The program's stated purpose was to test experimental aircraft and evaluate captured enemy technology in complete secrecy, using facilities that could operate without any connection to normal military channels. According to the discovered documents, Project Redwood had been established in early 1944 under joint sponsorship of the Navy, Army Air Forces, and Office of Strategic Services, representing an unprecedented level of inter-service cooperation for such a highly classified program. The underground facility had been constructed using advanced engineering techniques and specialized labor provided by carefully selected personnel who had been sworn to absolute secrecy about their work. The project's goal was to reverse engineer captured German technology while maintaining complete operational security about American efforts to develop advanced aircraft and propulsion systems. Sullivan's role in Project Redwood had been far more significant than the routine reconnaissance mission described in his official orders. According to the personnel files, he had been specifically recruited for the program based on his exceptional flying skills, engineering background, and proven reliability under combat conditions. His assignment involved conducting test flights of experimental aircraft and providing detailed pilot reports on their performance characteristics, capabilities, and potential military applications. The camera equipment he had carried during his final mission had actually been sophisticated instrumentation for measuring aircraft performance parameters rather than standard photographic equipment for surveillance purposes. The documents revealed that Sullivan's final flight had been a test mission involving experimental propulsion systems that had been reverse-engineered from captured German technology, including jet engines and rocket-powered systems that were years ahead of publicly acknowledged American capabilities. His Hellcat had been extensively modified with additional instrumentation to evaluate the performance of experimental aircraft that were being tested simultaneously from the underground facility. The mission had proceeded normally until Sullivan observed one of the experimental aircraft suffering catastrophic mechanical failure that resulted in the death of its test pilot and the destruction of irreplaceable prototype equipment. Faced with the loss of critical technology and the exposure risk posed by potential wreckage discovery by civilian authorities, project commanders had made the decision to order Sullivan to land at the underground facility rather than return to base as originally planned. His radio silence during the final portion of the flight had been intentional, designed to prevent any official record of the facility's location or the experimental aircraft programs being conducted there. The decision to conceal Sullivan's fate had been made at the highest levels of government, justified by the project's critical importance to national security and the need to protect German technology from potential Soviet acquisition. The facility's records contained extensive documentation of Sullivan's activities after his unexpected recruitment into Project Redwood, revealing that rather than being killed or imprisoned as some theories had suggested, he had been offered the opportunity to continue serving as a test pilot for the most advanced aircraft development program in American military history. The offer included immediate promotion, substantially increased compensation, and the promise that his contribution to national security would eventually be recognized once the project's existence could be safely revealed to the public after the war's conclusion. Sullivan had accepted the assignment after considerable personal struggle, understanding that his decision meant effectively disappearing from his previous life and allowing his family to believe that he had died in service to his country. Personal letters found among his effects revealed the emotional difficulty of this decision and his hope that the war's end would allow him to return to normal life and be reunited with Catherine and his family in Iowa. He had continued working as a test pilot for Project Redwood until 1946, when the program was terminated and its participants were transferred to other classified assignments or discharged under comprehensive secrecy agreements. The final entries in Sullivan's personal diary, discovered in his quarters within the underground facility, revealed that he had died in a flying accident during the spring of 1946, while testing an experimental aircraft based on German rocket technology that proved too dangerous for continued development. His death had occurred during the same period when Project Redwood was being shut down and its participants were being reassigned to other programs or discharged from military service. The timing suggested that Sullivan's death might not have been entirely accidental, but rather part of a deliberate effort to eliminate witnesses who possessed detailed knowledge about classified technology development programs that were being transferred to other agencies. The discovery of Sullivan's aircraft and the Project Redwood facility represented one of the most significant archaeological finds in modern American military history, providing unprecedented insight into secret weapons development programs that had shaped the early Cold War period and influenced American technological capabilities for decades. The underground installation contained technology, documents, and artifacts that revolutionized understanding of American efforts to acquire and exploit German scientific advances during the final years of World War II and the immediate post-war period. However, the discovery also posed immediate and significant challenges for the urban exploration team that had found it, as the facility contained classified technology and documents that remained protected under national security laws despite their age and historical significance. The explorers faced potential prosecution for unauthorized access to classified materials, while government agencies scrambled to determine how to respond to the exposure of a program that had remained officially secret for 8 decades and whose existence had never been acknowledged in any public forum. The comprehensive analysis phase of the Project Redwood discovery began immediately after the urban exploration team documented their initial findings and reported them through appropriate channels to government authorities. The complexity of the situation required unprecedented coordination between multiple government agencies, academic institutions, historical preservation organizations, and security agencies responsible for protecting classified information that might remain sensitive despite the passage of 8 decades since the original events. Initial response came from the Department of Defense's Defense Intelligence Agency, which dispatched a specialized team of experts to secure the site and conduct preliminary assessment of the materials discovered by the civilian explorers. The response team included military historians specializing in World War II technology development, engineers familiar with German jet and rocket technology that had been captured and exploited by American forces, intelligence analysts expert in classification procedures and national security implications, and security personnel responsible for protecting any information that might compromise contemporary intelligence operations or reveal sources and methods still in use. The aircraft preservation effort was led by Smithsonian Institution specialists working in coordination with Navy historians, Grumman engineering representatives, and independent experts in vintage aircraft restoration who possessed the specialized knowledge needed to properly evaluate and preserve Sullivan's Hellcat. The aircraft was found to be in remarkably good condition despite 8 decades underground, requiring only minor restoration work to return it to display-worthy condition and potentially even to flying status if such a decision was made. The specialized camera and instrumentation equipment installed for Sullivan's final mission provided valuable insights into 1940s technology development and revealed the sophisticated nature of Project Redwood's research objectives. Document analysis teams worked systematically through the enormous volume of materials discovered in the facility's filing systems, gradually revealing the scope and significance of Project Redwood as far exceeding initial estimates based on fragmentary references found in other declassified materials over the decades. The program had involved hundreds of personnel working across multiple facilities throughout the United States, with research activities that extended well beyond simple reverse engineering of captured German technology to include original American innovations that built upon German research to create prototype aircraft and propulsion systems that would not be matched by publicly acknowledged programs for many years. The personnel files discovered in the facility provided detailed information about everyone involved in Project Redwood, including their subsequent assignments after the program's termination and their ultimate fates in civilian or continued military careers. Many participants had been transferred to other classified programs that became the foundation for early NASA activities, advanced weapons development, projects, and aerospace industry research efforts that continued through the Cold War period and beyond. Several key figures had gone on to prominent careers in aerospace industry and government service, carrying knowledge of Project Redwood throughout their professional lives while maintaining the secrecy that had been demanded of them. Sullivan's personal effects and diary entries provided intimate details about daily life inside the classified program and revealed the psychological challenges faced by personnel who had been completely cut off from normal society for security reasons. His writings revealed the constant stress of maintaining absolute secrecy about work that he believed was crucial to national security, while simultaneously dealing with profound guilt about allowing his family to believe he was dead. The diary entries painted a detailed portrait of dedication mixed with personal sacrifice that characterized many participants in classified programs during the transition from wartime to Cold War operations. Technical analysis of the experimental aircraft technology found throughout the facility revealed sophisticated engineering achievements that had been decades ahead of publicly acknowledged American capabilities during the 1940s. Rocket propulsion systems, advanced aerodynamic control mechanisms, and metallurgical innovations discovered in the facility provided concrete evidence that American technological capabilities in the late 1940s had been far more advanced than previously known by historians or the general public. Some of the technology discovered remained classified because similar systems were still in use by contemporary military programs, or had influenced the development of current aerospace capabilities. The medical facility within the underground installation contained extensive records of research conducted on the physiological effects of high-speed flight and rocket propulsion exposure that had been conducted on each volunteer test pilots, including Sullivan and his colleagues. These studies had provided crucial data for developing life support systems and pilot protection equipment that were later used in subsequent aircraft development programs, space exploration efforts, and high-performance military aviation. The medical research had been conducted according to ethical standards that were appropriate for the time period, though some procedures would not meet contemporary requirements for informed consent and participant protection. Intelligence analysis focused on determining how German technology had been acquired and transported to the Project Redwood facility, revealing an extensive international network of operations designed to identify, capture, and exploit German research capabilities before they could fall into Soviet hands during the chaotic final months of the war in Europe. The program had involved close cooperation with British intelligence services, competition with similar Soviet efforts to acquire German technology and personnel, and coordination with Allied military forces advancing into German territory, where research facilities and personnel might be captured. The communications equipment found throughout the facility provided insights into the sophisticated security procedures that had been used to maintain Project Redwood's complete secrecy from normal military channels and civilian oversight. Encrypted communication systems, elaborate code procedures, and comprehensive operational security protocols revealed understanding of intelligence protection that had been developed specifically for programs operating outside normal command structures. Some of the security innovations discovered in the facility had been adopted by other classified programs and had influenced the development of contemporary information protection systems still in use by intelligence agencies. Archaeological analysis of the facility's construction techniques revealed engineering methods and construction procedures that had been borrowed directly from German military engineering specialists who had been recruited to work on American projects after the war's conclusion. The underground excavation methods, concrete formulation techniques, and structural design principles showed clear influence from captured German technical manuals and consultation with German engineers who had been brought to the United States under various recruitment programs. The construction quality and advanced techniques explained why the facility had remained structurally sound and habitable after 8 decades without any maintenance or inspection. Environmental analysis determined that the facility's underground location had provided ideal preservation conditions for maintaining aircraft, equipment, and documents in operational condition for extended periods. The stable temperature and humidity levels, combined with the sealed environment that had prevented oxidation and biological deterioration, explained why Sullivan's Hellcat and other sensitive equipment had survived in such remarkable condition. These natural preservation conditions, combined with the original preservation efforts undertaken by project personnel, had created a unique time capsule that preserved technology and information that would otherwise have been lost to deterioration or deliberate destruction. Legal analysis teams work to determine the contemporary classification, status of the various materials found in the facility, and to establish appropriate procedures for eventual public disclosure of information that no longer required protection. Many documents remained classified under current security regulations due to their connection to ongoing intelligence operations or their revelation of methods still in use by government agencies, while others had been automatically declassified by the passage of time or changes in technology that had made the information obsolete. The legal teams worked to identify materials that could be safely released to researchers and the public while ensuring continued protection of information that remained genuinely sensitive. International coordination efforts were required because some of the technology found in the facility had been acquired through cooperation with Allied intelligence services during World War II and the immediate post-war period. British, Canadian, and other Allied nation representatives were consulted to determine their interests in the discovery and to ensure that any public disclosure would not compromise continuing intelligence relationships or reveal methods still being used by Allied services for contemporary operations. The international consultations revealed that several Allied nations had conducted similar programs involving captured German technology, suggesting that Project Redwood had been part of a broader international effort to acquire German scientific advances. Media strategy development teams prepared comprehensive plans for managing inevitable public interest in the discovery while protecting classified information that could not be revealed without compromising national security. The combination of a missing World War II pilot, secret underground facilities, and advanced technology promised to generate intense media attention that would require careful management to prevent unauthorized disclosure of sensitive information while satisfying legitimate public interest in this remarkable historical discovery. The media strategy balanced transparency with security requirements in ways that would allow meaningful public disclosure without compromising ongoing operations. Historical preservation specialists evaluated the facility for potential designation as a National Historic Site, while considering the complex security implications of allowing public access to areas containing classified technology and information. The underground installation represented a unique and irreplaceable example of World War II-era military architecture and contained artifacts from secret weapons development programs that had no equivalent in publicly accessible museums or historical sites. However, preserving the site for historical purposes required careful balance between its educational and historical value and the continuing security concerns that prevented full public disclosure of its contents. The psychological evaluation team assessed the potential mental health implications for Sullivan's surviving family members who would finally learn the truth about their relative's fate after 8 decades of uncertainty and unanswered questions. The revelation promised to provide closure about Sullivan's actual death, while potentially creating new emotional trauma related to the deception that had been maintained for so many years, and the knowledge that he had actually survived his supposed death date by nearly 2 years. Counseling. Services and support resources were arranged for family members who might need professional assistance in processing this long-delayed information about their loved one's fate. Scientific analysis of the experimental aircraft remains, and prototype technology found throughout the facility provided valuable data about early jet and rocket technology development that had previously been known only through incomplete documentation and theoretical speculation. The physical artifacts allowed researchers to understand the actual capabilities that had been achieved by classified programs during the 1940s and to compare them with contemporary technology development efforts in other countries, including both allied nations and potential adversaries. Some findings required extensive classification review before they could be shared with academic researchers or incorporated into historical studies of aerospace development. The comprehensive analysis phase required nearly 2 years to complete, involving dozens of specialists from multiple organizations and requiring extensive coordination between government agencies and civilian institutions that had never worked together on such a complex project. The process revealed that Project Redwood had been far more significant than anyone had suspected, representing a crucial bridge between World War II technology acquisition efforts and Cold War weapons development programs that would shape American military capabilities for decades and influence the technological competition that characterized the Cold War confrontation with the Soviet Union. The final analysis report confirmed that Lieutenant Commander James Robert Sullivan had indeed died in service to his country, though under circumstances that were far different from what his family had been told, and in ways that had contributed significantly to American national security during the crucial early years of the Cold War. His work as a test pilot had advanced American aircraft technology by years and had provided crucial capabilities that were later used in the confrontation with the Soviet Union. The discovery ensured that Sullivan's sacrifice would finally be recognized and remembered, even though the full story had remained hidden for 8 decades due to the extraordinary security requirements of the program in which he had served. The revelation of Sullivan's true fate and the discovery of Project Redwood represented a watershed moment in understanding American military history during the crucial transition from World War II to the Cold War, providing concrete evidence of classified programs that had only been speculation among historians, and revealing the remarkable technological achievements that had been accomplished in complete secrecy during the 1940s. The underground facility and its contents demonstrated the extent to which American military and intelligence agencies had succeeded in acquiring and exploiting German technology while maintaining security that had protected these achievements from both foreign adversaries and domestic oversight for 8 decades. The discovery also illustrated the profound personal costs of national security decisions that had required extraordinary personal sacrifice from ordinary individuals serving their country during times of international crisis. Sullivan's story represented thousands of similar cases where military personnel had been asked to disappear from their normal lives in service of classified programs that could never be publicly acknowledged, accepting personal sacrifice for the greater good of national security during the dangerous transition from World War to Cold War confrontation that had shaped the modern world.